Now to our guests in studio. Again, Gonan Ben Yitzchak, as well as Dr. Natan Aridan. Let me start with you, just to put this in perspective for us. You know, the White House says that what they did, calling Jerusalem the capital of Israel, it was an honest assessment of the situation on the ground. It does not mean they're taking sides. Why do the Palestinian people think that that's wrong, that they did take a side, that it was prejudging? Why is there such a difference of opinion when it comes to it?
I think one of the major problems is that there's a lack of perspective here. What has actually happened? In 1995, the Congress passed an act which instructed the President of the United States to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So there has been a recognition. The other thing is that every country has the right to decide where its capital is going to be. Now, what has actually happened is that Donald Trump, for internal reasons, which I'm not going to go into, has decided that he's going to complete his promise. What has actually happened is the United States has recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but it is still committed to a two-state solution based on Palestinians and Israelis working out what in fact will be, and he hasn't defined which Jerusalem. So the United States has still not recognized the annexation of East Jerusalem according to the Jerusalem law of 1980.
Let me put this in a little bit of historical perspective for us. So here's the deal right now. Every country has their embassy in Tel Aviv. That was not always the case. There was a time where several nations did keep their embassies in Jerusalem, but that has not been the story for years. 86 countries have their embassies in Tel Aviv, 0 in Jerusalem. Trump says that that is changing. He's already ordered the State Department to begin preparations of moving the embassy. The process of hiring architects and engineers already underway. It will take years. But there is diplomatic space in Jerusalem already. 9 countries, you saw it there on your screen, have diplomatic missions in Jerusalem. 5 countries have consulates in East Jerusalem, and the others have their in West Jerusalem. This now is a list of the foreign embassies in Tel Aviv. It's scrolling there. You can see 86, 0 in Jerusalem. Let me turn back now to our studio. Gonan Ben Yitzchak, give us a sense of what's happening on the ground now, especially in light of another day of rage tomorrow, threats of warnings of another intifada. What's the security assessment today? How significant is it moving into the hours to come tonight?
One thing that happened this morning is that Hamas called people to uprise and start a new intifada. This comes a day before the prayers in Al-Aqsa tomorrow on Friday, so of course all the eyes are looking at what's going to happen in Jerusalem tomorrow, because this is not only that Muslims are going to gather in Jerusalem for the prayer, but also this is a place that symbolically can be a place where they can start the uprising. So right now, the fact that the PA sent students from high schools early home to take part in uprisings and protests all over the West Bank is not a good sign for Israel. We see in Khan Yunis, in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, some clashes between Israel and the Palestinians. So tension is rising, and it doesn't look so good.
Do you think, why is the physical location so important of this embassy? It's just a building.
The fact of the matter is that countries have diplomatic relations and their embassies are in the capitals of those cities. But I want to bring to a certain perspective which is missing from the news. In 1953, Israel moved its foreign ministry from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. There were massive protests from the United States, from Britain, from France, etc., and the foreign ministry moved there. The main question which we need to ask, and I think that many Americans are asking, is what does America get out of this? In other words, has there been an advance on the peace process? The answer is no. So why is it being done now?
But one of the big questions that's being asked about, why shake up the status quo in such a powerful way? We're coming up on a break. We'll be back in just a minute with more reaction. Again, we have live images from across the region as these protests intensify. We'll have more live reporting and more analysis from our in-studio guests, so stay tuned. We'll be back in just a minute right here in this special edition of Daily Dose.
I-24 News. This week on Holy Land Uncovered, we'll discuss the connection between religion and education. We'll tour Tel Megiddo, a northern Israeli site where, according to the New Testament, the end of time will begin. And we'll meet the Raelians, a spiritual movement who believes God is actually ancient scientists from outer space.
At first, it was called the War of the Rocks, the violent Palestinian uprising, which began in a Gaza refugee camp, would eventually last for over 5 years and claim some 2,000 lives. 30 years later, I-24 News looks back on the first Intifada, where it took Israel and the entire Middle East. All day, December 7th, only on I-24 News.
I'm Emily Francis on I-24 News. Join us on Trending right here on the show that shines the light on the many amazing people doing positive work to inspire. This is the show about building bridges.
Weekdays at 8 a.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
Middle East politics has its own set of rules. In Israel and beyond, public figures play an elaborate game of cat and mouse with the media. We'll break it all down for you with our all-star panel of movers and shakers.
The Spin Room with Ami Kaufman, Sunday to Thursday at 8:05 p.m. Eastern.
Through all of these years, presidents representing the United States have declined to officially recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. In fact, we have declined to acknowledge any Israeli capital at all. But today we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. This is nothing more or less than a recognition of reality. It is also the right thing to do. It's something that has to be done.
And thanks for staying with us. Of course, those are the president's historic words last night. Joining me now is Mustafa Barghouti. He is a Palestinian politician, as well as the leader of the Palestinian National Initiative. We want to get this perspective on our show right now. Sir, thanks for being with us. Appreciate your time on this day. Let me ask this question regarding Trump's words. In his speech, he did not say united Jerusalem or an undivided capital. He specifically said, we're going to leave the borders up for discussion in the future, and he said, I want to keep the status quo in place when it comes to the Temple Mount. He even referred to it in Arabic. So what's your reaction to that perspective, that perhaps Trump isn't as anti-peace process, anti-Palestinian as some are fearing?
No, this is what you just said is absolute nonsense. Because if he really believes in negotiations, and these are final status issues, well, then why did he recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel and not capital of Palestine as well? No, he didn't mean that. He's now playing with words, hoping to absorb the shock that he has created. And it will not work. President Trump has already put himself with Israel in one place, in the place of justifying occupation, justifying a system of apartheid, and he will be described as the president who killed the 25 years of negotiations and who has aborted his own peace initiative before it was born.
Sir, I want to get your reaction to a quote that we had, the interview here in I-24 News on the program The Spin Room. This is from yesterday. A Republican congressman from Florida, he serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He said that he doesn't agree to recognize East Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital of a state. He even thinks that the Palestinian people are still an enemy of the American people. I want to play that soundbite for you, sir, and get your reaction to his words. This is an American congressman.
You don't make and broker peace with your current enemies. And the actions of what goes on with the Palestinians are not one that proves that they are a former enemy. They are, in fact, still an enemy. You look at one of the things that we just voted on here in the House of Representatives, something known as the Taylor Force Act, where we go out there and we say no longer will the dollars of U.S. taxpayers go towards Palestinians when they're in the midst of paying the families and the terrorists themselves for committing acts of terrorism against Israelis. This is something that isn't going to happen.
Sir, can I get your reaction to those words, those strong words from the congressman?
He's not a congressman. He's a fascist. He's a true fascist. A man who doesn't understand anything and probably totally ignorant. We're not enemies of the American people. We respect the United States. We respect the American people. But we do not respect this American administration like most of the American people. And one day the American people will get rid of this senator or congressman, as well as they will get rid of President Trump, who is driving the United States in his reckless policy into very strange places. We have no problem with the public or the American people or the United States of America. We don't even have a problem with Jewish people. We have a problem with Israeli occupation. We have a problem with the system of oppressive apartheid that Israel has subjected Palestinians to. We have a problem with the ethnic cleansing that Israel has practiced against Palestinians. We have no problem with anybody who does not deny us the right for freedom and independence and dignity like everybody else.
Sir, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, hundreds of thousands, they call Jerusalem home. They dream of sharing in the capital of Jerusalem in their future state. Is hope lost? What is your message to the Palestinian residents of Jerusalem today?
Can you... Hello?
Sir, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, are you still with me? What is your message to the Palestinians of Jerusalem right now?
I didn't understand the question. Repeat it, please.
Okay, what is your message right now to the Palestinian people of Jerusalem?
Palestinian people think East Jerusalem is their capital, and they will steadfast and stay there. And there will be a day when Palestine will be free and when East Jerusalem will be the capital of Palestine. And there will be a time when Israelis also realize they have to have a real peace camp. And when they will realize that the Israelis themselves will not be free unless we are free, unless apartheid is gone, that will be a real good day. Not a day of triumph of one side over the other.
Sir, Mustafa Barghouti with the Palestinian National Initiative. Sir, thank you so much for being with us. We're running out of time in this block. We'll be back in a minute. But, sir, give me your reaction just to the words you heard.
Well, the problem is that there is not a state of Palestine. And therefore, the question that he asked is, why does not the world recognize? The only thing that can be done is when Israelis and Palestinians negotiate together, not being forced by any other state to work out what the final borders will be, then there will be a solution to Jerusalem. And what we've been engaged in, what we've seen over the news, is the news about protests, the news about Trump. But there's a lack of perspective here. And the fact of the matter is that we need to understand that its capital is Jerusalem, but the United States hasn't changed the status quo. The status quo has not changed on who has rights on the Temple Mount. Far from it.
All right, we'll have to leave it here. We're coming up on a break. We're going to keep our guests in studio and get more perspective and live reporting that you won't see anywhere else. Stay with us. We'll be back in a minute.
I-24 News.
Politics, economics, business, and technology. Get the real news and the real insight about what's happening around the world. Michelle McCory breaks down the top stories of the day from the Middle East to the U.S. Weeknights beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern.
I'm Tracy Alexander for I-24 News. Join us on Perspectives and get the whole picture as we break down the day's top stories from all angles.
Perspectives, Sunday to Thursday at 5:05 p.m. Eastern.
Of Daily Dose. Let's go live now to Washington, D.C. Our correspondent Mike Vicchiera is standing by for us. Thanks for being with us this morning, Mike. Are we learning new details about the lead-up to Trump's speech? Who perhaps in the administration supported it? Who may have spoken out against it?
Well, it's a great question because many critics in the United States of this decision, as well as around the world, see this as the result of the political process, political expediency on the part of President Trump, and not the goal of advancing the peace process. They look to the backing of evangelical Christians, a vital part of President Trump's political base here in the United States, particularly Vice President Pence, a hero to the evangelicals, and he, in fact, was one of those within the administration who was pushing this decision very hard. We all know the background here of the 22 years that have gone by with waivers being signed by successive presidents every 6 months, including just this past June when President Trump signed the waiver. So White House officials are emphasizing, and State Department officials have been emphasizing over the last 24 to 48 hours, that there really is no change here other than the fact that the president is following through on the campaign promise to announce these plans to recognize Jerusalem as the capital and to eventually move the U.S. Embassy there. And there is some question, as I'm sure you're aware, of exactly how long that can take, given the logistics involved and the planning involved and the security involved in that decision. So it's very early here in Washington on the East Coast. The sun is not yet up. We haven't had reaction to some of the pictures that you've been seeing from the West Bank and some of the protests. But by and large,
Mike, even as you're talking,
the criticism, the political...
Mike, even as you're talking, I mean, I know it's dark there outside the White House near where you are. Here, it's the middle of the afternoon. We're seeing these live images. We're seeing images of tear gas being deployed, of confrontation. And we know that Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, told his team in D.C. to come back home. Do you think the White House expected this? Did they plan for a setback like this, for confrontations, for violence? Did they have a foresight that this could happen?
I think if you look at some of the things that they said and some of the behind-the-scenes maneuvering, including keeping U.S. Embassy personnel home, advising embassy children in Amman, for example, not to go to school that day, beefing up security around the embassy, sending cables to various embassies around the region, I think that they did anticipate, or at least they planned for the contingency of violence and protests in response to what the president has done here. I think that there is a feeling, and again, the United States has not yet woken up to these pictures and these protests, but as of yesterday, there was a feeling that there would be obviously an outrage, an outcry on the part of Palestinians and those who support their cause, but that it would be short-lived and perhaps, as President Trump said, this has not been working. The approach that has been going on for decades now has not been working. There's no reason, it would be folly, in his words, to continue this. And I think a lot of people are under the assumption that after the initial outrage, the initial protests, a lot of this would sort of lose steam, and then people would come back to the table, Jeff.
All right, Mike Vicchiera standing by this morning in Washington. Thanks for that analysis as the sun will rise soon over the East Coast. And again, those are live images in Bethlehem that we are showing of this standoff between the IDF and dozens, if not hundreds, of protesters. We're going to keep our eye on that. We also have correspondents spread out across the city, across the country. Let's go live now to our Ariel Levin-Waldman. Ariel is in Jerusalem as well, getting a reaction in West Jerusalem. Ariel, give us a sense of where you are, what you are seeing today, and any reaction to Trump's speech last night.
Look, right now you can see behind me Jerusalem. It's actually pretty quiet right here, and it's the quiet of a city that's really waiting for the other shoe to drop. I've spoken to Israelis both today and yesterday, and they were really looking at this from two different angles. Yes, a lot of Israelis are extraordinarily happy that they've seen this this declaration made. They say it's the recognition of a fact that's been true for 50 years. Jerusalem is Israeli. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. However, now comes what comes next. The other shoe dropping, both on the streets, as we're seeing the clashes out in Beit Lechem. We saw the clashes just yesterday in Hebron, but also the possible political other shoe dropping. Remember Trump's own speech the other day. He did not give up the idea of a two-state solution, in fact, coming out and explicitly endorsing it himself this time. He did not use the word undivided capital even once in the course of the speech. And he said that the status quo in Jerusalem has remained unchanged, that the borders of Jerusalem are still up for discussion. And that has a lot of Israelis very concerned. What does that mean? And what does this other shoe dropping mean? What comes next? Well, if this is something thrown into the deal to sweeten the pot for Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis, when are they going to have to pay the piper? And that's the question on a lot of Israelis' minds and a lot of Israeli politicians' minds. What concession will Trump demand as compensation for this declaration?
All right, Aridan Waldman in Jerusalem for us, giving us his analysis and his sense of what it's like on the ground right now. Appreciate that. Let's go back in our studio again. Dr. Natan Aridan with the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism, as well as security expert, former Shin Bet agent, analyst Gonen Ben Yitzchak. I'm going to turn to you, Gonen. Let's talk about perhaps the regional implications here. We know that today Abbas was in Jordan meeting with King Abdullah. We know that there was an emergency weekend meeting of the Arab League. I guess what kind of plotting and planning, diplomatic and otherwise, is coming from Israel's neighbors now?
Well, first I think we need to emphasize that this recognition is, in Israel everybody's happy, but this is kind of poison pill. It's a poison pill because the United States is very passive in the Middle East for the last few years, and certainly now when we see Iran getting stronger and stronger in Syria, in Iraq, in other places. So when we see that Israel and other Sunni states like Saudi Arabia are coming closer and closer, and they have the same initiative to fight Iran, suddenly Trump is doing something
to provoke
this process.
You're an analyst, but also, a former security agent. We know the public words, the public face of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ministers. Behind the scenes, though, behind closed doors, really, are they worried, or perhaps about what Trump said and the implications from it?
I'm afraid that for Mr. Netanyahu, Prime Minister, this is good news because this draws all the attention into Jerusalem and the implication of what's going on in the area. And now we are not going to talk about what's going on with the police and interrogations. So for Netanyahu, good news. For Israelis and for the history of Israel, if we look at it as a process, I think very bad news, because basically President Trump said we are going to be passive not only with Iran, we're going to be passive with our relationship with Israel and the PA, because if you're a Palestinian leader, you're not going now to let the United States do anything with the peace process.
Let me turn to Dr. Aridan. A big question today is, will other countries follow Trump's lead? Or are they going to wait and see? What's your best sense of what will happen?
Well, I understood that a couple of days ago from the Czech Republic, they were also considering similar wording. But the real fact is, what does this have? And I agree with the comments mentioned earlier. The United States needs to have more of a presence, and passivity is a serious problem. On our aspect in Israel, there's a saying: "Be careful of what you wish for," and this is the outset of what's happening. Now, we don't need, the Palestinians do not need any excuse to have demonstrations and violent demonstrations about many things. But what's not being issued, and I've seen on other TV networks, and I'm very pleased with what you're doing, is in terms of balance. There's a lack of perspective here. The status quo has not changed in Jerusalem. All the United States has said, and of course this is groundbreaking.
The Palestinian perspective is that Trump's words, at least it represents a violation of international law.
First of all, in terms of violation of international law, Israel's occupation of East Jerusalem and its annexation is not recognized. What needs to be recognized is that Israel is the capital of Israel. Sorry, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And I stress again that the only settlement that can be will be between Israelis and Palestinians, defining what the borders will be,
what the sovereign lines will be.
And the United States hasn't changed that policy at all.
And in fact, in Trump's remarks, he did explicitly and carefully say that it needs to be figured out the final status between the Israelis and Palestinians. All right, we're going to come out for a short break, but we have more live images of these confrontations and protests and more analysis coming up. Stay with us.
Every stone, every street, every scar tells the story of Israel. A place that speaks of the souls of Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Changed by time and conflicted, its magic still echoes in the hearts of its people. Join I-24 News' Jordana Miller on a journey through history. Watch Holy Land Uncovered every Sunday at 10:05 a.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News. In the Holy Land, there are wonders most people never get to see. I-24 News will take you inside the shadows and unravel the secrets of some of the world's most revered sites in a way you've never experienced. All access from every angle. Tune in to Sacred Sites 360, Sunday 9 p.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
I'm Khaled Ben David.
And I'm Nareet Ben.
Join us on The Rundown here in the heart of the Middle East for a candid conversation.
A closer look at the stories born out of this region and driving changes all the way to Washington. Every Monday through Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
I understand the deep attachment that Jerusalem holds in the hearts of so many people. It has been so for centuries. It will always be. In this moment of great anxiety, I want to make it clear there is no alternative to the two-state solution. There is no plan B. It is only by realizing the vision of two states living side by side in peace, security, and mutual recognition, with Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and Palestine.
That is the Secretary General of the United Nations. We should point out tomorrow morning, the UN Security Council will hold an emergency session on Jerusalem dealing with what Trump said, and that will happen tomorrow morning in New York, an emergency meeting. Let's turn live now back to East Jerusalem. Our correspondent, Michael Puchak, standing by, keeping an eye on possible protests developing. Michael, give us an update over the last 40 minutes. What have you seen? What's going on?
Well, Jeff, essentially what we had is at the Damascus Gate, a group of women had convened, started chanting. It was a small protest at first, but it wasn't long before a mass convened around them. And now, essentially, it's quite a large protest. I'd say there's at least a few hundreds of people around. And the protest has essentially spread from the Damascus Gate. The police here, trying to contain it, have tried to move some of the young men out. And that has caused a situation, as you can see over here, whereby a lot of the protesters were actually pushed out of the Damascus Gate area, and in so they started throwing bottles, glass bottles, as well as rocks at the police forces here, and that caused the police to respond, Jeff, with police horseback as well as armed police on foot. And Jeff, as you can see now, it's a little bit more quiet, but there was some drama. There was a flare up here. It looked for a minute that it would escalate, and indeed it did for just a short time. It's cool again now, but it stands to reason it's going to flare up again.
All right, Michael Puchak reporting live. Again, these flare-ups, cool down, flare-ups, cool down, that can't be exactly what police are hoping for. Give us your thoughts going in on what these live images that we're seeing and what's going on from a security standpoint.
Well, I thought and said earlier that the number of casualties today will affect what will happen tomorrow in Jerusalem.
And you mean just could not people killed, people wounded, rocks thrown, both at Israelis, but also Americans and American soldiers who are now perhaps being targeted?
Definitely, and I think that right now somehow the PA is trying not to control the mob, but is actually controlled by the mob, because, you know, the PA had the ability to tell people, let's see what will happen. They can try and find a different path to somehow exploit what happened, but they went to, you know, the old way of sending people out to clash with Israel. I think that tomorrow will be, after the prayers in Jerusalem, this will be a big test to what's going to happen in our region.
Give us a sense. We're seeing now, of course, there's tear gas being thrown, there's protest rocks being thrown into the piers, certainly fires being. Do you think this is, by an estimate, a precursor of worse things to come? And perhaps what should America do about it?
Yes, well, America should either, or maybe President Trump should re-announce and explain what he meant, and maybe do something that he needed to do before, and this is to explain, Chairman Abbas, what he means and how he sees the situation. I think that President Trump didn't think about what will happen after his speech, because what we see now is really just the trailer before the real movie. The real movie will start tomorrow after the prayers.
Give us your thoughts, perhaps, as well as the international players involved. Saudi Arabia, their perhaps involvement, their interaction with the president, as well as, of course, the big news from Turkey threatening to cut off ties in light of this, and Erdogan's travels today. I mean, this is an international situation. Give us a sense of really what the consequences could be.
I'm not quite sure what the consequences will be, because I'm not a futurist, but I can say that there's a difference between qualified action. I think it doesn't surprise the Saudis about this issuance of a statement. Turkey, you have to understand that what's being played here is internal politics in Israel with Netanyahu, internal politics of Trump, and internal politics within the Muslim world, including Turkey, of who controls what is going on, who speaks for Muslims in the Middle East. This is part of a greater story.
Do you think a day later, in the hours after Trump's speech, do you agree with going on that, even though Trump said it, that I'm still willing to work on the two-state paradigm if it's amenable to both sides, I still want a peace deal, I still want to respect the status quo? That was lost in the first half of his speech. Was it's time to recognize Jerusalem as the capital. Could Trump's speech have been worded differently?
First of all, it wasn't lost because it was never found. Sorry about the pun. He ignores his advisors, and had he been salient and more capable, he would have made the qualification. He would have said, this is obvious reality we are recognizing, but we still do A, B, and C. He didn't stress that enough. Now, whether he'd stressed that enough, I don't think it would have changed anything on the ground. And I think that's part of the mistakes that are being made in the administration. And it's important to know that most of his advisors were against this statement. And this is part of Donald Trump trying to carry out his policy.
I mean, one of the arguments is that stirring the pot, it's about time to stir the pot. Let's shake things up a little bit. Let's recognize the reality of Israel's government on the ground, and then move forward from there. Let me try and separate the capital situation from the peace process situation.
Can I say again with a pun, this is the worst area to try and stir a pot.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of sheikhs around as well in terms of shaking. But I think, and it's important to stress, what is being missed here is what is going on in the Muslim world. What is going on with Turkey? What is going on with Saudi Arabia? What is going on with Yemen? But there is one factor in the litmus test, which perhaps you can ask later on to my colleague, is what will happen in Ramallah. Because there is an economic success story there, and that, I think, will be the litmus test, not what's going on in Jerusalem or Bethlehem.
And we are keeping an eye on what is happening across the West Bank, in Ramallah, in Bethlehem, around the region. We have live images of these protests and these fires that are growing now by the hour. We'll stay on top of it. And we're going to have more live coverage from around the region, across Jerusalem, across the West Bank. I want to thank both of our guests for being with us over this hour, going to Ben Yitzchak, as well as Dr. Aridan. Thank you so much, gentlemen, so much for your analysis and expertise. We'll be back in just a minute with another hour of Daily Dose, more live coverage and reporting you won't see anywhere else.